Thank you, everybody, for being here for another session of the Monterey Initiative in Russian Studies. And it's a real privilege and a pleasure to introduce Professor William Pyle. He's a Frederick Dirks Professor of International Economics at Middlebury College, and recently had very exciting positions at the Center for Economic Studies at University of Munich. I don't speak German, so I probably got it wrong.
Yeah, neither do I, actually.
Okay, well then that's another thing we have in common. And also at the Bank of Finland, and that is a pretty remarkable association because Will, with a colleague, Laura Solanko, won the Russian National Prize in Applied Economics for the research in Russian business lobbies, which I'm pretty sure there's lots of things to say and lots of things not to say about that. And now he's working on a long-term project relating to the effects of economic dislocation in Russia during the 1990s. So his perspective on vast segments of the Russian economy and society gives him a particularly interesting position to analyze the long-lasting effects of the collapse of the Soviet Union and how that is very much alive in today's global economic, social, political, and military realms. So my pleasure to introduce Will Pyle, and you have the floor.
Thank you so much. Thank you everybody for coming today. Thank you to the audience that's watching over Zoom. As I was telling the students earlier, this is my second visit to the campus. The first one was 12 or 13 years ago. I talked to Anna's class. I'm hoping to see her tomorrow. I understand she's jetting in from a conference in Rome. I'm going to be talking about some of my recent research, but to set the stage and drawing our attention to what's been in the news in the past couple months, these have been a shocking couple of months of suffering and death, and we all fear that there will be much more in the weeks and months ahead. Russia's decision to invade Ukraine was made by one man. The suffering and death on our TV screens and social media feeds has been caused by one man alone. Now, while recognizing that fact, and while remaining sensitive to the suffering and death, in my remarks today, I'd like to take a step back and address the topic of the country that Russia has become in the 21st century. My thesis is that Russia in the 21st century, the Russia under Putin, has been greatly shaped by the experience of its exit from communism in the 1990s. That decade brought both an economic shock and a shock to Russians' collective identity. What Boris Yeltsin helped launch in the early 1990s, an ambitious project to throw out the old state-planned economy, to end the Communist Party's monopoly on political power, and to break up the Soviet Union, was seen by many Russians by the end of the 1990s to have failed. The experience of the 1990s, particularly the early 1990s, shaped the political preferences, beliefs, and attitudes of Russians, including Putin, in a way that has endured. That experience of the early 1990s is responsible, at least in part, for what might be described as a reassertion of Soviet values: anti-market, anti-democratic, and pro-imperial. Nostalgia for the Soviet Union has become deeply embedded in the Russian worldview. It hasn't faded. In a poll taken this past fall by Russia's leading independent pollster, the Levada Centre, whom you here at the Institute have collaborated so productively with in recent years, found that almost 2/3 of Russians would prefer an economy based on government planning than one based on private property. And half would prefer the Soviet political system to the alternatives. A survey by Pew Global Research in 2019 found that relative to peoples in other post-communist countries, Russians were in fact the least enthusiastic about the transition from communism to a multi-party system and market economy. Putin, we also have long known, shares a certain nostalgia for the Soviet Union, and at least in its imperial power. In 2005, in a kind of State of the Union address to the upper house of Parliament, he said, "First and foremost, it's worth acknowledging that the demise of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the century. As for the Russian people, it became a genuine tragedy." Putin's words drew the attention of Western commentators and officials alike, fearful, perhaps rightly so, that they might signal expansionist ambitions. What many didn't realize at the time was that those words reflected the belief of average Russian citizens. From 1992 on, and certainly from 1999, the year Putin became president, up until the present, a consistent majority of the Russian public has expressed regret for the collapse of the Soviet Union. Back in February, this February, in the week before the invasion, CNN commissioned a poll of over 1,000 Russians and 1,000 Ukrainians. Asked if they had a positive view of the Soviet past, 71% of Russians said that they did, and only 9% said they didn't. Another question that the pollster asked was whether Russians felt the use of force was justified to keep Ukraine from joining NATO. 50% said they did, only 25% said no. Polling the Russian public since the invasion has become much more complicated and much more fraught. Since speaking out publicly against the war has become criminalized, it's reasonable to assume that many Russians who oppose the war might either refuse to take part in surveys or falsify their preferences when asked. Nevertheless, there have been several major attempts to take the public pulse after the invasion was launched. The Levada Centre conducted an in-person nationally representative survey across 50 federal subjects in the last week of March. The sample size was over 1,600. 81% of the respondents supported the war, with just over half expressing complete support. Though Levada's reputation for independence is unimpeachable, their publication of the poll was widely criticized by those arguing that war opponents may have lied or disproportionately may have refused to participate. Political scientists have popularized a method to elicit truthful preferences in conditions where respondents may want to conceal what they truly believe. It's called a list experiment. A relatively large group of respondents is split into two similarly composed groups. Respondents in one group, a control, are asked something like, how many of the following 3 policies or people do you have a favorable opinion of? You don't have to say which ones in particular, you just have to give a number. I support 0, I support 1, 2, or 3. The other group, the other half of the respondents, the so-called treatment group, they're asked about 4 people or policies, the 3 that the control group saw, plus 1 additional group or policy that's the one that the researchers are most interested in. Researchers that can then compare the average across the 2 groups to infer how many support that one person or policy that only the treatment group was asked about. And nobody is compelled in any direct sense to answer about a specific policy or person. So for instance, if the average respondent in the control group says that they support 1.8 of the 3 people or 3 policies, and the average respondent in the treatment group says that they support 2.3 of the 4 that they see, then the difference between the 2.3 and the 1.8, that 0.5 or 50%, is probably a pretty good estimate of the honest support for the 4th person or policy. Earlier this month, 2 researchers at the London School of Economics carried out that sort of list experiment on a Russian internet platform, somewhat similar to Amazon's Mechanical Turk, which recruits people to perform small tasks for pay. On this Mechanical Turk analog in Russia, the researchers recruited 3,000 respondents and asked them how many of the following 3 policies they supported: monthly monetary transfers for poor Russian families, legalization of same-sex marriage, and 3 state measures to prevent abortion. The treatment group got all those 3, but they also got a 4th, the action of the Russian armed forces in Ukraine. On the left-hand side, you'll see the distribution of respondents to this online survey. As you can see, it skews younger and more educated than the population at large. The bar chart on the right here, the bar chart on the right shows the support for the invasion using both the list experiment and a direct question. The darker blue bar on the left is the list experiment. It shows 53% support for the invasion. The lighter blue bar shows that when respondents were asked directly about the war, 68% said they supported it. So clearly, when asked directly, there's a portion of respondents who choose to falsify their true beliefs. Now, of course, that 53% support in the list experiment would almost certainly be higher if this were a representative sample of the population, since greater shares of older and less educated Russians tend to support the war, but they're less likely to be recruits to an online platform, such as the one used in this particular survey. Applying a very simple weighting scheme, a correction, for the biased nature of this sample, the researchers at LSE determined that roughly 61% of Russians truthfully support the war. It's not the 81% that the Levada Centre researchers estimated, but still, I think for a foreign audience, for a Western audience, considering the costs that the war has and will impose on Russians in blood, treasure, and global reputation, it's a surprising majority endorsement of Putin's actions. Now, clearly, there's a lot to unpack in that endorsement. There's a lot of content that needs to be considered, including, of course, the unrelenting stream of lies and propaganda that Russians are being fed on state-owned TV. The content that I want to bring to today's presentation is that of the 1990s, a decade that I believed helped lay the foundation for the Russian worldview of today. I'm going to make 3 points based upon research that I've carried out recently with the help of co-authors. Each of the points is based upon analysis of either voting data or survey data. Each of the points ties the experience of the early 1990s to changes in Russians' political preferences and beliefs. Each of them ties the economic shock and/or breakup of the Soviet Union to Russians' alienation from the liberal values that animated their country's exit from communism. Point 1, if the economic shock, as opposed to some other factor, shifted people's beliefs and attitudes, then we would expect the Russian regions hardest hit by the economic reforms of 1992 to be the ones in which the support for Boris Yeltsin, the architect of those reforms, would erode most dramatically. And that's what we in fact find. Economic decline in the early 1990s drove a significant shift in political preferences. Point two, I find that individuals who suffered the most economically in the early years of reform were many years later more prone to embrace Soviet-type values, anti-market, anti-democratic, and pro-egalitarian. Life experiences in the early reform years, in other words, left a deep and enduring impression. Point three, according to comparative survey data, Russians over the past quarter century demonstrate a much higher degree of what my co-author and I call a blind or aggressive patriotism, a greater willingness than people of other countries to trade butter for guns, to give up economic well-being for military might, and to stick with their country, right or wrong. This blind and aggressive patriotism predated Putin's term in office. It doesn't seem to have been caused by him or his control of state media during his time in office. And we have some evidence that it spiked only after the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991. My interest in doing research on public opinion is relatively recent. 5 years ago, Austin will remember, I taught a first-year seminar at Middlebury on the old Soviet economy and its collapse. I chose the reading and viewing material for that collapse not to emphasize the perspective of elites, but the perspective of average people. I wanted students to get a sense of what it was like to be a citizen, to be a worker, to be a consumer in Soviet society, to live in a country that was a global superpower, that made claims of ethical superiority to other industrialized societies, and then for all that to change really rapidly overnight, for that life to disappear quickly in the span of just a couple years. One of the books that I assigned, and maybe Austin you remember, was an oral history by a Belarusian journalist, Svetlana Alexievich, who won the Nobel Prize in Literature for a series of oral histories, most of which focused on the Soviet era. The book of hers that I assigned for Austin's class was Secondhand Time. It's about how average Russians experienced the demise of communism. Her interviews highlight a real nostalgia for the Soviet Union's achievements and a deep sense of loss at its collapse. The book is full of individual stories about people's struggles to adapt to a new environment in the early 1990s. More than anything else, that book got me thinking about the factors that shape Russians' beliefs about the way society should be ordered. Reading it, I couldn't help but think that the wrenching experience of leaving one socioeconomic system, communism, for another socioeconomic system, market-based capitalism, would leave a lasting impact on those individuals that experienced it. So as a quantitative social scientist, as an economist, I started thinking about ways that I could bring to bear data to address the sorts of themes that not only Alexievich had explored, but also sociologists and anthropologists who were conducting open-ended interviews with Russians who lived through that period of the early 1990s. How could I draw on what some might call harder evidence to explore if and how that period left an enduring effect on Russians' worldviews? Did that era of declining average incomes, the early 1990s, increasing economic inequality, dramatic drops in life expectancy, almost unprecedented in peacetime in the 20th century? Did all that leave a lasting impact on the political preferences and beliefs of average Russians? A couple of years ago, Timur Natkov, a Russian economist, and I were talking at a conference about an important line of research on the effects of, for the US economy, of China's integration into the World Trade Organization. In the United States, in places with industries that competed directly against Chinese exporters, the darker regions on this map, the costs of China's entry into the WTO 20 years ago have been significant and persistent. In many parts of the US Midwest and South, in regions producing things like electronic goods, furniture, toys, manufacturers were just going about their business, producing what they produce, and then suddenly a country with hundreds of millions of low-wage workers joins the world economy to compete against them. David Otter, an MIT labor economist, and his colleagues have shown that wages and labor force participation rates remained depressed in those darker regions, and unemployment rates remained elevated for at least a decade, if not more. A recent paper by another group of researchers found that so-called deaths of despair, drug overdoses, are also disproportionately higher in these regions that were disproportionately affected by the so-called China shock. Not surprisingly, there have been political implications as well. Fox News viewership has risen disproportionately in the darker regions, and those darker regions have disproportionately voted more extreme members to Congress. That line of research is about how China's integration into the global market played out in other parts of the world, and the United States, as a large, regionally diverse country, provides a good setting to identify the asymmetric effects of a massive market liberalization shock. Timur and I agreed that Russia and what it experienced in the early 1990s was not dissimilar. Across its large and diverse geography, manufacturing firms were just going about their business, producing what they produce, and then all of a sudden they were hit by a market shock, but of a different kind than trade competition with China. For them, it was a price and trade liberalization shock introduced by their own government, the Yeltsin government in 1992. 30 years ago, Russia's regions had economic profiles shaped by decades and decades of investment decisions made by communist planners. Because of those decisions, Russia's firms and thus its regional economies differed in their vulnerability to a sudden liberalization of markets. Some firms and regions would be relatively uncompetitive initially. Some would be relatively more competitive initially. And as the China shock literature showed, Timur and I expected that post-liberalization social outcomes would respond to that pre-liberalization economic variation inherited from the Soviet era. The outcome that Timur and I first chose to focus on was the change in voting support for Boris Yeltsin at both the federal subject and district levels between 1991 and 1996, a period that bridges the market liberalization shock of January 1992. We hypothesize that there will be bigger declines in support for Yeltsin in those regions which, because of their Soviet economic inheritance, were more vulnerable to the rapid market liberalization plan he unleashed in January of '92. To track variation in voting for Yeltsin, we draw on two data sets that span those periods between '91 and '96. One covers federal subjects. Russia has 80+ federal subjects, oblasts and krais, for those of you that understand the words that refer to Russian geographies. And one that covers raions, or districts, kind of analogs of US counties. And there are over 2,000 of these raions. We dug up data from the Russian archives, Timur actually did, the Russian state archives, on voting at the raion level, and we integrated that into our analysis. The Yeltsin vote in 1991, when he received 58% of the total vote for president of the Russian Republic, when it was still a part of the former Soviet Union, functions as a baseline, capturing something like the region's ideological disposition before market liberalization. On January 2nd, 1992, just after the Soviet Union's dissolution, and Russia gained its independence from the other countries in the former Soviet Union, Yeltsin's government liberalized international trade as well as nearly all consumer and producer prices overnight. It was called a pen stroke reform. He just needed to sign an act, a presidential decree, and prices were free. In the 1996 presidential election, Yeltsin received a 36% plurality of the votes in the first round and went on to win re-election with 55% majority in the second round over the communist candidate. To test the hypothesis that Yeltsin's electoral support eroded the most in the regions most vulnerable to liberalization, we need a way to assess regional vulnerability on the eve of market liberalization. Now, there's a great deal of writing on the Soviet economy from a generation ago, the sort of people that were my mentors when I was in graduate school, pointing to the inefficiency of the Soviet manufacturing sector. Some experts, in fact, referred to the entire Soviet manufacturing sector as value subtracting. That is, the economic value of its inputs was greater than the economic value of its outputs. Within manufacturing, many experts, many commentaries highlight the unique backwardness and uncompetitiveness of the industrial machinery and equipment subsector. Now, for each regional unit, whether federal subject or rayon, we can capture its industrial structure at the end of the Soviet era by aggregating up from a census, a 1989 census of Soviet industry, which includes in Russia over 21,000 civilian enterprises categorized as industrial. We use it to measure per capita regional employment in manufacturing and subsectors of manufacturing, including industrial machinery and equipment. Of the 14 million workers at firms covered by the industrial census, 12 million are in manufacturing, and 2 million of those are industrial machinery and equipment. Missing from these numbers, you might be curious, is employment in the military-industrial complex. Unfortunately, we didn't have in this census, this industrial census, access to employment directly in firms in the military-industrial complex. But there's a wonderful group of economic historians based at the University of Warwick that is tabulating and geolocating all the individual enterprises in the late 1980s in the defense industrial complex, and we account for which regions, which raions had more firms, although we don't know the employment level at all those firms. We account for the numbers of those firms in our analysis. These two maps give you a flavor for what we can produce with that data. Here we've got per capita employment in manufacturing at the rayon or district level. And here we've got per capita employment in manufacturing, here we've got per capita employment in manufacturing at the district level. Here we've got per capita employment in manufacturing at the federal subject level. These are the oblasts. This slide and the next tell our basic story of how Yeltsin's support falls most in regions whose inherited economic structure made them most vulnerable to market liberalization. Each dot in the scatter plot is a region, a federal subject. On the horizontal axis is per capita employment in 1989. For the left panel, it's per capita employment in manufacturing, and for the right panel, it's per capita employment in industrial machinery and equipment. On the vertical axis is the percentage of voters in the region that supported Yeltsin in 1991. This is before market liberalization, and in both panels, there's a clear positive relationship between per capita employment in market vulnerable sectors and support for Yeltsin. In 1996, this is the 1991 panel. Hope I had that. In 1996, in the first round of the presidential election, the relationship has become negative. Support for Yeltsin actually hasn't changed much in the regions whose economies were least vulnerable to market liberalization, but it's collapsed dramatically in the regions that were heavy in manufacturing and were most vulnerable to market liberalization. Now, in highlighting the connection between the economic structure in a region inherited from the Soviet era and swings in post-liberalization voting, we believe what's happening is that life is simply becoming more and more difficult, more and more complex in those regions that relied upon manufacturing, and regions that were poorly prepared to face competitive market forces. The best available measure that we have to assess changes in human welfare at the regional level from before 1992 to afterwards is the regional mortality rate. Mortality rates, many of you might know, spiked dramatically in the early 1990s in Russia, particularly for those in their prime working years, particularly for those in their mid-40s, mid-50s. So to the extent that there were economic roots for the increase in mortality rates, we would expect that those regions most vulnerable to the economic shock would have experienced the biggest increases in mortality. We see here in the figures that all-cause mortality increased where per capita employment in manufacturing was highest. And this seems to have been driven by increases in cardiovascular and circulatory diseases, which can directly relate to stress. The dark blue lines that lies above in each panel is the mortality rate in regions with above the median manufacturing employment per capita. And the red line represents regions with below the median concentration of manufacturing employees. Now, I'd like to switch from considering regions to considering people, to considering individuals, and pose the question of whether those individuals who suffered the most, not just the regions that suffered the most, but the individuals who suffered the most from economic liberalization in the early 1990s had their worldviews altered in a way that endured into the 21st century. There's a hypothesis that one's life experiences, maybe you guys agree with this, I don't know how old you all are, those of you that are students here. There's a hypothesis in social psychology that one's life experience in young adulthood, between the ages of 18 and 25, leave a more lasting impact on life experiences than at other stages in life. This is often referred to as the impressionable years hypothesis. Not too long ago, two economists put that hypothesis to the test by looking into whether living through a downturn in the US economy at some period in the latter half of the 20th century influenced worldviews much later in life. And what they found was that those who lived through regional economic downturns in the US much later in life, compared to their peers who didn't experience downturns during their impressionable years, those that did experience the downturns during their impressionable years were much more likely to embrace a more progressive outlook, more in favor of redistribution, government redistribution through the tax system, more likely to vote for the Democratic Party. Living through economic downturns at other periods of life didn't seem to have that sort of long-lasting effects. Now, in the Russian context, I'd like to think about impressionable years in a slightly different way. Reading through oral histories and sociological and anthropological studies, so many of them pointed to the years right around the Soviet Union's collapse as having a lasting impact. Russians in the early 1990s were learning lessons for the first time about how a market economy functioned, how private property functioned, about how democracy and free elections functioned, and they were drawing conclusions and forming beliefs. For Russians, their individual life experiences during those early reform years had the potential, I hypothesize, to leave a deep and lasting impression. So rather than thinking about impressionable years as referring to young adulthood, I'm using that phrase in the Russian context to refer to what I hypothesize is a unique period in history, a period of transitioning from one social system to another social system. I home in particularly on the period from 1989 to 1994. It's a period that covers the last 3 years of the Soviet Union and the first 3 years of an independent Russia. It's a period that's bracketed on one side by the dissolution of Soviet control in Eastern Europe and the unraveling of the Soviet economy, and on the other side by the privatization of a large percentage of Russia's industrial base. It's a period in which the old rules governing how society was organized were thrown out and new ones were introduced. It's a period when so much was so new for so many. I couldn't have explored the hypothesis without access to a wonderful data set. The European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, a London-based development bank founded in the early 1990s by Western governments looking to help countries transition from communism, carried out a massive survey across the post-communist region in 2006, asking a whole bunch of questions of at least 1,000 individuals per country. The questions that I most was interested in had to do with respondents' attitudes and beliefs, whether they felt democracy was a good political system, whether an economy based on markets was better than alternatives, and whether they felt their government should do more to redistribute income and wealth. Now, these are their attitudes and beliefs in 2006, well into the Putin years, 7 years into the Putin years, periods of relative economic prosperity, because the previous 7 years had been years of economic growth. And you can see still in 2006, Russians lagged behind their post-Soviet colleagues with respect to support for democracy and support for market economics. One set of questions in the EBRD survey had a retrospective or looking back in time component. People were asked about potential life experiences that had occurred in 1989, 1990, 91. Did they lose a job in any of those years? Did they suffer wage cuts or wage arrears? Did they go on the government dole and receive unemployment benefits? People were also asked in that same survey a lot of information on their lives in 2006, their employment status, their income, whether they felt they were doing well financially compared to other people. Then they were asked questions about how much education they had, whether they were married, and whether they had other people, including children, living with them. They basically collected a ton of personal information. With statistical software, I can look at all that data and effectively make comparisons between Russians that are similar in all observable respects, all respects that the data allow me to compare them. Same education, same household structure, same gender, same age, similar economic circumstances in 2006. And I can compare two similar, observationally similar individuals and see if those who experienced hardship during the impressionable years, see if they, on average, felt differently from those who hadn't with respect to the desirability of democracy, a market economy, and a government that actively redistributes income and wealth. The slide here presents results from that exercise and shows that Russians who suffered in those years when everything was changing have, on average, a very different outlook on the world. They're more skeptical of democracy, they're more skeptical of market economies, they're less supportive, they're more supportive of a more activist government role in terms of redistributing income and wealth. In effect, they're more likely to hold on to what we might call traditional Soviet values, rather than to embrace the values that drove Russia's transition away from communism. Interestingly, I don't find any relationship in the data between individuals' experiences with labor market hardships and their attitudes after 1994. The relationship only holds for labor market experiences between '89 and 1994 and their beliefs in 2006. With respect to the other countries in the former Soviet Union, although they also experienced very profound economic shocks after the collapse of communism, in the EBRD survey data, I don't see a similar pattern connecting personal experiences with economic hardship in the early 1990s and their personal beliefs in 2006. Now, I speculate, and it's really only speculation, that the reason has to do with Russians' economic suffering in the early 1990s being compounded by a psychological blow that they, and not the citizens of the other Soviet republics, former Soviet republics, suffered. For Russians, identification with the Soviet Union was much stronger than for the peoples of the other post-Soviet states. The Soviet Union's collapse was for Russians experienced much more as a psychological loss. In the oral history volume that I mentioned earlier, there's a story of a woman in her 50s, a doctor who's describing in her memories of the early 1990s, and she's talking about the economic difficulties like inflation, lost savings, a sense that she didn't have the skills to adapt to the new market economy. But then without missing a beat, she's speaking about just having seen a down-on-his-luck war veteran on a street in Moscow selling off his war medals to Western tourists. The pain and shame that come through in her voice, in her description, that we were once a superpower, and now look what we're reduced to. That pain and shame of status loss seems equal to and totally mixed in with the economic hardships that she suffered. That the people of former empires, Russia's included, bear a particular psychological cost when the empire collapses has been noted by many historians and many Russian commentators. I cite here two relevant quotes. The first comes from an unsigned editorial that appeared in the leading government newspaper, Izvestia, on Christmas Eve in 1991, just before the hammer and sickles was brought down from flying over the Kremlin. The unsigned editorial concluded by saying, "The Union is dead, but parting with it will be long and difficult. The great power idea is as potent as the national idea, and in the right circumstances can unify millions." The other quote comes from Yegor Gaidar, the brilliant economist and courageous public official who served under Boris Yeltsin. In a book that he wrote just before he died, that was all about the lessons for the post-Soviet Union from the declines of other empires. He wrote, "The identification of state grandeur with being an empire makes the adaptation to the loss of status of superpower a difficult task for the national consciousness of the former metropolis." And here he's clearly referring to Russia. The exploitation of the post-imperial syndrome is an effective way of obtaining political support. And here he's clearly making a dig at Putin. The concept of empire as a powerful state that dominates other nations is an easy sell product, like Coca-Cola or Pampers. It doesn't take intellectual effort to advertise it. Now, if Russians in the 21st century, in fact, regretted the loss of global superpower status, the Levada Centre, going back 2 decades, has posed something similar to that question in a way that highlights a possible trade-off between living in a country that is a, quote, respected and feared great power, the red portion of this bar graph, or in one that simply has a high standard of living, the blue portion of the bar graph. Maybe I have that. I have it wrong. It's the blue portion. I have it twisted there. So the blue portion is prioritizing economics. The red portion is prioritizing great power. Okay. For a couple of years, right after Russia seized Crimea in 2014 and Putin's popularity soared, Russians were split equally between these two possible responses. For all other years, however, anywhere between 32 and 43% chose the respected and feared great power option. My colleague Michael Alexeyev and I have been thinking about these sorts of numbers and asking ourselves how to evaluate them. What does it say about a country that roughly 40% of its population would choose to live in a great power at the cost of having a high standard of living? It's not a coincidence that Putin's popularity in his first decade in office peaked right after a brief and successful war with Georgia in 2008, and then hit an even higher peak in 2014 after the annexation of Crimea. Russia's military assertiveness in what it calls the near abroad has played very well with the Russian public over the past 15 years. And if you believe the most recent Levada Centre poll, Putin's popularity is soaring yet again. Michael and I felt it was very appropriate to look at the question of Russia's public policy, Russian public's foreign policy values in a comparative way. Cross-country comparisons have shed light on and provided context for all sorts of subjective phenomena. Cross-country comparisons of happiness, trust in other people, cross-country comparisons of preferences of various social systems. All have been the subject of rigorous academic analysis. Discussions of Russians' foreign policy preferences, however, have been entirely devoid of this sort of comparative analysis. Holding up the opinion of Russians to those of residents from other countries, we feel, can give us a new vantage point from which to assess the Russian public's foreign policy orientations. If Russians don't feel the pull of the great power idea, if they don't suffer from a post-imperial syndrome, then we shouldn't observe unique patterns in how they answer questions about foreign policy and the costs they are willing to bear to achieve foreign policy objectives. Now, there's a rich literature highlighting the varieties of individual national attachment. One seminal work in this field distinguishes between patriotism, which captures the degree of love for and pride in one's nation, and a patriotism reflecting a perception, that's on the one side, a benign patriotism, and on the other side, a patriotism reflecting, quote, a perception of national superiority and an orientation toward national dominance. Another recent work in this area further refines that characterization of the more malignant of the two forms of patriotism as being, quote, linked to aggressive militarism and demanding, quote, blind and uncritical allegiance to country. A set of questions in the International Social Survey was designed to get at these distinctions. Over the past several decades, individuals in several dozen countries around the world have been asked questions like the ones in this slide. Whereas Russians are not exceptional in any way in an international sense with respect to how they answer the questions under the benign patriotism heading. They are exceptional with respect to how they answer the questions on the right-hand side. Here's the question: people should support their country even if their country is in the wrong. You can see going back to 1995, continuing through 2003, and up through 2013, Russians are either the top or the second most in this group of 16 countries. Here's the question: my country should follow its own interests, even if this leads to conflict with other nations. 1990s, 2000s, 2010s, Russians are outliers with respect to how they answer this particular question. Here's a question: I would like my country to increase its military and defense spending, even if doing so requires increased taxation. This is the great power idea, a robust military. Here we can see mid-1990s, early part of the 2000s, Russia is an outlier, a little bit less of an outlier a couple years after the Crimean annexation. Unfortunately, well, there are a couple things to say about those three charts. First of all, Russians are consistently outliers with respect to their foreign policy orientation, with respect to blind patriotism, aggressive patriotism. Second, that outlier status is not exclusively an artifact of the Putin years. Michael and I think that's a very important point. That orientation was there in the 1990s as well. Unfortunately, the International Social Survey questionnaires for Russia don't go back before 1995. So we don't know how far back in time Russia's outlier status goes. The World Values Survey, though, does have a round in 1990 and a round in 1995 in which Russia participated, and there was a similar question to one of those three that was asked in the International Social Survey program, and it goes like this: people sometimes talk about what the aims of their country should be for the next 10 years. Would you please say which one of these you consider the most important? High level of economic growth, strong defense force, people have more say about how things are done, or making our cities and countryside more beautiful. So basically, economic values, political liberalization, stronger military, or environmental values. In this slide, we see the difference in terms of Russia's rankings between the 2 years. The left panel is the ranking in 1990. The middle panel is the ranking in 1995. And the final panel is the difference between 95 and 1990. Russia climbed more in terms of its support, its relative support for the military value relative to the other countries. Though their economy was tanking in the mid-1990s and democratic institutions were shaky, Russians were collectively shifting to being more worried about military spending. The fact that Russians had experienced 5-6 years of recession, dramatic recession, makes these numbers even more surprising. That there was this kind of willingness to forego economic ends, forego butter for guns. I'd like to conclude by saying that I hardly know what the future holds. I was one of many that didn't think Putin would invade. I do believe, however, that there was a great deal of wishful thinking and commentary, particularly early on, about Putin potentially losing the Russian street and facing a popular uprising. Of course, there are courageous Russians, many courageous Russians, who have protested the war, and thousands, we know, you know, have been arrested. But Russia is a country of tens of millions, and Putin has remained consistently popular with most of them over the past 2 decades. Increasing number of Russian casualties, increasing economic pain associated with sanctions will put that popularity to the test. But I'd be surprised, very surprised, if there's any appreciable public uprising in Russia in the foreseeable future. Russians see Putin as the leader who brought an end to the instability and shame of the 1990s. The well of support for him for doing that remains deep. I'll end with a rather provocative quotation from the Nobel laureate Svetlana Alexievich from an interview that she gave 6 years ago. In the West, people demonize Putin. They don't understand that there is a collective Putin consisting of some millions of people who do not want to be humiliated by the West. There is a little piece of Putin in everyone. Thank you very much.